Andres, thanks to you for that very warm introduction. Andres it helps embody, I think, one of the things which I like best about NDN, a group which I've been proud to be associated with for over 10 years now. But it's the marrying of domestic U.S. politics with issues of globalization, of foreign policy, of Latin American foreign policy, but to create a policy debate that is very vital, that takes Latin American foreign policy issues and makes them relevant here within the United States, takes issues of importance to the Hispanic community, helps reflect them in our foreign policy. It's that marrying of politics and policy which I think is the most effective aspect of NDN's work. Simon Rosenberg, who just came in and sat in the corner, who is indeed the godfather of all this, has really created an extraordinarily vital enterprise here. And thank you, Simon, and thank you, Andres, for letting me be a part of what you're doing. We have a wonderful occasion today to be able to have a really very good, intimate, in-depth discussion with one of Washington's finest ambassadors. Carolina Barco has been representing the government of Colombia here in Washington for almost 4 years now. Before that, she served as foreign minister of Colombia for 4 years. And she herself comes from a distinguished diplomatic and political family. And as those of you who don't know her will learn in a few moments when she opens her mouth, she also speaks English better certainly than I do, and more elegantly. You arrived here in Washington, Ambassador, at one moment of real political inflection point, which was the early part of 2006. And you watched just months later as the Democrats took substantial majorities in both the Senate and the House, and then 2 years later when President Obama was elected president. It's one of the great privileges of being an ambassador in Washington that you get to be a witness to great political events unfolding before you and then have to explain it back to your colleagues. So I thought I would ask you today, how's Martha Coakley doing?
I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, it's possible that we may be witnessing yet another inflection point in American politics, and one that I know that your president and compatriots at home are going to be following with great interest, even as we do. More seriously, this is an election year in the United States. Colombia has had an extraordinarily active interaction with the United States for at least the last 10 years in its modern phase, touching on narco-trafficking issues, touching on anti-terrorism issues, touching on military funding issues, touching on trade issues. This is perhaps as broad an agenda as any of our neighbors to the south have with us, save perhaps Mexico. With that broad agenda, in an election year, what do you think the highest saliency issues will be between Colombia and the United States during this year, and how do you see the year unfolding?
Thank you very much, Nelson, and I'm very pleased to be here, and I appreciate all of you taking time from your lunch to be here, and so it's a pleasure, and as you said, this is a conversation, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with all of you. It's a year that started off very well. I only got back to Washington last Thursday because we had the visit of...
You're on there.
I am. No? Okay, there we are, I think. All wired up now. So I only got back on Thursday because Congressman Engel, who's taken a very active role in the international affairs and in Latin America, went down for the fourth time with a group, this time with Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey from California and Congresswoman Shelley Berkeley from Nevada, and with Pedro Pierluisi from Puerto Rico. So each time he has been taking down a different group, and we had a chance to go over these different issues, and they were able to have a conversation with President Uribe, which was very, very interesting. As you know, Congresswoman Woolsey is apparently the head of the Progressive Caucus, so it was interesting to be able to sit down and have a good conversation with her, and I think she was very impressed by the progress Colombia has been making, and which is a tribute to the kind of relationship and cooperation you were talking about. Then Deputy Secretary Steinberg was in Colombia for 2.5 days, and we were able to go to Tumaco, which is on our coast, on our Pacific coast, right, sort of on the border with Ecuador, one of the most complicated areas at this moment, and we'll talk about how we have been making progress in fighting drug trafficking, but as a result, the drug traffickers, which are now our illegal groups that have become basically drug traffickers, are seeking these paths out to the Pacific. And so Tumaco is one of these areas that's become very, very complicated. So we went to see it with Secretary Steinberg because it allowed us to see that very integral way that we're approaching the problem of drug trafficking, which is not only the part that has to do with control, but of providing alternative crops. And we went to see one of cocoa. And as many of you know, if you're chocolate lovers like I am, Ecuadorian cocoa is excellent. And Tumaco, which is right there, it has excellent cocoa also. So this is a crop that sells its product before they even plant it. So it has a great market, and it's a good alternative. So we started the year with a visit from Secretary Steinberg and from Congressman Engel, and so we're ready to get going. The issues, I think, this year, although, you know, the free trade agreement for us is very, very important, I think that we all know that we were hoping there was a little window of opportunity, given that there's concern about creating jobs. And if we look at this issue dispassionately, but it's difficult because it's a very emotional issue, the U.S. economy has been growing because of trade. And your exports have been very important in creating jobs. So we, the countries that had free trade agreements pending, were hopeful that maybe as there was a conversations about creating jobs that we'd be able to talk about trade. But it's a difficult issue to talk about, and I realize that it's an issue that is very emotional, and where there's a vision that trade is equal to exporting jobs. And so it's a difficult issue to get your hands around, but which definitely I think we need to do much more talking about, and to really understand how important trade is for the U.S. economy, and as well as important in creating these stronger ties. So I will continue to work on that, understanding the difficulties of the domestic politics and explaining them back home, as you well say. But this year we're also hopeful that we can start working on other issues where Colombia has an important role to play. One, not only in the drug trafficking, where I think what Colombia is doing now, and I think that's very, very important, is we've been the recipient of a lot of support, and a lot of support from the U.S., a lot of support from Europe, and we have been able to develop certain abilities to fight the drugs. So we now have specialized police that are excellent in the fighting the drugs, and as a result, we're offering courses in Colombia in helicopter training. We've been sending some of our police to Mexico to help, to Guatemala to help. We've been sending a group to Haiti when the drug trafficking was the main issue. Now, of course, we have such a tragedy where we need to address so many other issues. But Colombia is trying to provide and help in areas where we've gotten this expertise because we've had to face these issues. But we're also helping in the region with other issues which we think are important. And one of them has to do with biofuels. Colombia has been working towards creating a very clear policy to produce ethanol, but I think we're further ahead in biofuels. And we have been helping and have helped to build some plants in El Salvador and in Guatemala and Honduras. And so what we would like to do now is to start working with the U.S. on these new issues that we're all concerned about, which have to do with climate change and have to do with clean energies. So I think this year, as I work very hard for our free trade agreement, as we continue to address the issue of fighting drugs, we would also like to work on these new issues related to climate change and to clean energies, where Colombia was able to participate in that group with President Obama in Copenhagen when the final draft was made of the declaration. So we clearly feel these are other strengths we have that we would like to partner with you as we look at this new year, and as we also seek to become much more active in providing cooperation and taking that step forward as we have made progress.
One of the issues that arose last year in U.S.-Colombia relations, which I think is very poorly understood here in the United States, is the issue of the expanded basing rights for the U.S. military operating in Colombia. And I thought this is an issue that needs to be understood better here in the United States. It has certainly been misunderstood throughout much of South America, and I think probably intentionally misunderstood by many people there. But perhaps you could outline for us today what the enhanced basing agreement really provides and how you see it operating going forward.
This agreement that we signed, which was called the Defense Cooperation Agreement, that's right. Basically, what it did was restate many of the principles by which we were already working under Plan Colombia. It maintains the same kind of agreement we have, which allows U.S. access to our bases based on previous agreements and with participation of the Colombian military. So they're not American bases in Colombia. It's access to our bases and done in cooperation with us and with our knowledge and participation. Secondly, it's directed at fighting drugs, knowing that it is very important to have surveillance and to know exactly what is happening. So basically, we continue along the same lines that we had in Plan Colombia, which had to do with the reconnaissance and the fighting the drugs, which became important for the U.S. When the Manta closed down, but in a way, it was doing what we were already doing. The same kind of restrictions as to the number of members of the military that can be in Colombia and the civilians, which are 400 and 600 in Colombia maximum, continues to be exactly the same. And the kind of jobs that they're doing, which are basically training, cooperation. There's no participation in any activities. We don't have military on the ground. Basically what they're doing is a lot of training. So that it maintains totally the same spirit of the agreement and the way we're working with Plan Colombia, because Plan Colombia has been in place maybe longer than we expected, and we think that it needs to continue in a way in which Colombia will be assuming more and more responsibility, but understanding that fighting the drugs has been much more difficult than any have expected, and it has to be seen with a regional view. So that even though the U.S. now is working so closely with Mexico in the Mérida Initiative, this does not mean that we forget about Plan Colombia. It means that we have to have a very coordinated kind of policy between Plan Colombia, the Mérida Initiative, the U.S. policy, and the Caribbean Basin. This has an effect on everybody, and what we need to do is to make sure that we're totally integrated the way the drug lords are, who know no borders. We need to be able to develop that kind of expertise. So this is basically what this cooperation agreement was all about, was picking up on those areas that we thought needed to be laid out very clearly, but in exactly the same kind of focus, objective, etc., that we had in Plan Colombia. That's why we were a bit surprised that there was such a reaction from our neighbors, because maybe, yes, we should have had a better communication strategy. But I think part of the problem was that we didn't expect the kind of reaction that we got from our neighbors. And as you say, I think it has to do in part with the kind of politics that are going on, that we have in the neighborhood at this moment, the kind of differences we have in the neighborhood, and that just put it in a different light than the original Plan Colombia, you know, the way it was received. Although, I guess we should have learned that even Ecuador was very uncomfortable with Plan Colombia originally, and some of our other countries, because they didn't know exactly what its strength would be and exactly what its implications would be. So I think we could have done something much better with respect to a communications strategy, but basically it is working along the same lines as Plan Colombia and just defining some of the, just putting, I think, dotting the I's and crossing the T's about issues, you know, the way we were already working.
On the important issue of economic integration, which you touched on earlier, I met last week with Fred Hochberg, who is the chairman of our Export-Import Bank here in Washington, and he has laid out for EXIM's priorities, which are to promote U.S. exports, to help provide U.S. government financing and funding for U.S. exports. Colombia is one of his top 8 countries in the world on which he would like to focus, on which he would like to build and focus. In fact, he is in Colombia this week on a trip that I know he was looking forward to very much, and which I assume you and your embassy played a key role in organizing. Tell us a little bit about some of the commercial goals that EXIM has in Colombia, and how you see that deepening the commercial integration between the countries.
Yes, we're very, very pleased with this visit, and we're so glad that the director has seen Colombia as one of the top countries potentially for EXIM, for the EXIM Bank. As the 4th largest market for U.S. exports in Latin America, Colombia is an interesting market. We're the largest exporter in another area of agricultural products. Sometimes we don't realize all the relationship we already have. But what he is looking for is potentially new areas to work in. And he has identified renewable energy, gas, aviation, information technology, and construction as areas where the Export-Import Bank can play a role in Colombia. This is very interesting because at this moment in Colombia, our Ministry of Trade has been trying to look sort of at that second generation of exports and areas where Colombia can become more competitive. At one point, we identified the flowers and apparel and et cetera, but for many years now, we've been sort of growing along the same lines. And so Luis Guillermo Plata decided to carry out a study with McKinsey and look and see which were these new areas where Colombia could be competitive. And these areas that Mr. Hochberg has defined are part of the areas where we see that we think we can be competitive. So it's a good moment for U.S. alliance with Colombia. We have already been working in Colombia to look at how we can have a chain of improvement, how we can work together to improve these areas. And we had identified renewable energy, we had identified information technology, we had identified medical tourism, people going down to get minor kind of procedures in Colombia where we have excellent doctors and it's less expensive. So it seems to me that this is a very interesting moment. We are ready now to move on sort of to a second generation of areas where we can have new alliances and new exports. And we are very, very hopeful that with this visit, we'll be able to get some more of these alliances going. Bogota, for example, has a very interesting program that has received support from the US, but also from the World Bank, which is called Invest in Bogota. And what Bogota has been doing is identifying companies and areas that could do well in Bogota. And in the last 2 or 3 years, each year it has identified 5 or 6, last year it was 9 different companies that are going into Bogota and starting up. So we're definitely in a moment of great opportunities. So these kind of conversations and visits, I think, are going to be very productive, and we all seem to be working in the same line. And so I think we were very, very pleased by this visit, and we hope that we will continue to work along these same lines.
You know, Simon, it occurs to me, Fred Hochberg has now made, this is his second visit to Latin America. He was in Brazil last year. He's now in Colombia this year. We should invite him to come and address NDN. Yeah, yeah. And one of the wonderful things about convening this group here at NDN, Ambassador Barco, is that the audience has people who are just as expert often as the people sitting up on the stage.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna open up to the floor in just a minute, but and so we can get a good dialogue going. Let me ask you this question before I do that. I started off by noting this is a political year in the United States. It's also a political year in Colombia. It's been widely reported that President Uribe has been considering a third term. In fact, there are constitutional processes that have been going on for some time that would, if the law were to be changed, permit him to run for a third term. There are limits to which you as an ambassador can or should be commenting on the political situation in Colombia, but maybe you could at least give us a status update on where matters lie now with the constitutional changes that have been moving forward and with the political landscape as it's shaping.
Okay. This constitutional change, which would allow for a third period for any president who would already have been in place for 2 periods, is being carried out through a process of referendum. So it originally, the question or the proposal to have this referenda was a popular one, so it required 5 million signatures. This then proposal was taken to our Congress and had to be approved by our Congress in 4 votes, 4 sessions, so which would be 2 legislative years. So it's House, Senate, House, Senate, and then was approved a couple of months ago. From there, then it had to go to a constitutional revision to see if 2 things, to look at 2 aspects. One, whether the procedure that was carried out, the raising of the signatures, the way the question was made, the congressional procedure was correct, if all these steps that should have taken place took place and was done correctly. And secondly, whether having a third period will affect our constitutional, our democratic principles. So they have to look not only at the process, but also at what we call the substance. The courts are still looking at this, and they will have till 3 months more, so till March, they will have to analyze this. One of the analysis that they had to receive was from the Inspector General, from the Procurador, who just came out with his analysis last week. It's a recommendation. It's not something that's obligatory, but his recommendation was, and his analysis was, that the process had been correct and that the referenda should go ahead. Were the court to decide that the referenda can go ahead, then we would have to call for a referendum. It would have to be voted. A referendum requires a 30% of all votes, which would be the highest, no, more than 30%, because it would be the highest, it requires it to be the highest vote that we've ever had. And then if it were passed, then the president could decide. So what is very important is that all these steps, which are involving different powers and different groups, take place in an absolutely transparent and clear way, respecting all of our constitutional requirements. And that, I think, is what we're most concerned, and we want to make sure that this is absolutely the way it's carried through. After that, the president will have to decide whether he wants to run or not. And we will also have to see whether there's time, because our elections, our presidential elections, take place in May. And there was speculation as to whether there would be a change in the date for the elections. The president came out very clearly yesterday and said that there would be no change in the election date. So we would have to see whether these decisions, the court makes its decision, whether the referendum could take place, whether the president decides to, within this space. So that's why the panorama is not so clear. But I think what I would like to reiterate, what the president is very committed, and what as a Colombian we're very committed to, is making sure that this is a transparent and a clear process, totally respectful of our Constitution, so that any decision that were to come out of it would be respectful of our Constitution and of the procedures.
Thank you. With that, let me go ahead and open it up to our audience here. And you know from seeing the list, our audience here consists of people from Capitol Hill, from the Latin American think tank community, from the American business community, from the press. And so I think we're going to have a good set of questions coming at you from here.
Okay.
Yes, in the front row. And if you could let us know your name,
Sure.
what organization you represent,
Thanks.
and
Silvana Ricciarini, I'm from Colombia. I represent the International Code Council, ICC, which is a prominent building code developer organization in the US. It's a pleasure being here, and I enjoy the discussion, Ambassador. You mentioned some of the second generation areas of potential for Colombia, including renewable energy, gas, aviation, construction, for example, which is the area I'm working on. And I can see, and linking this into the whole trade issues, I can see a very interesting point where educational platforms between the US and Colombia and other Latin American countries can come together to explode the area of jobs for the US and Colombia. So my question is, I am very, very passionate about linking, education and the areas where we work. Is how involved is the academia in both countries in order to push things forward for trade as a purpose of pushing forward the trade agreement? That's one question. And another question is if it is possible to access the study from McKinsey, if we can have the reference.
It's in the webpage of
Ricardo Triana, I'd like you to meet, is the head of our economic office here in Washington.
Yeah, there is a webpage. gov.co, and there you can find in a link of productive transformation, or in Spanish, transformación productiva. There you can find the sectors that had been chosen and the business plans for each of the sectors that they have chosen.
And with respect to education, you're absolutely right that I think when we started talking about trade agreements, the ministry also started working with our universities because we need to be prepared to be competitive. If we're going to be competitive, we need to have people who are ready and prepared. So definitely the universities have been involved in thinking about these areas, and we're working closely with the universities. The free trade agreement would have some aspects related to education, but I think mostly what we realize that Colombia has to be prepared. If we really want to take advantage of the opportunities the free trade agreement offers, we need to make sure that we are preparing people to be able to compete. I think one thing that's very interesting about what's been happening in these last few years in Colombia is, one, we've been able to extend our general education. We now have a 92% coverage. And we have taken some loans from the World Bank to make university education more accessible, to be able to give scholarships to those who could not reach or go to the universities for lack of the adequate funds. But we have also worked on a training institution that has a very long history in Colombia called SENA. And it was very well respected, but it was an institution that had once again stayed sort of with the old kind of businesses. So it kept on training people to be seamstresses, and it kept on doing the same, to be just plain construction workers. So what this government did when it came in is meet with the different industries and find out what kind of labor they needed and in what areas they weren't finding people. So a lot of it had to do with using new computers and working with robots and these other kinds of things. And as a result, it has modernized. And before, it was a very sad story that people said they'd go to SENA and then they couldn't find jobs. People now go to the SENA and are finding jobs, so that we are getting a much more interactive kind of relationship between our education and the economic needs. And I think this is something that we're finding that is very, very useful. So much so that in this new cooperation that I was talking about before, SENA is one of the areas of cooperation that Central America has been asking us for the most. They have wanted to see how our programs are carried out, and we have been working with, I think, in Guatemala, and I think in Costa Rica, in fact, and El Salvador, on programs with the SENA, because this model is turning out to be much more responsive and effective.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Ambassador. Thank you for having me. My name is Octavio Hinojosa. I'm the Executive Director of the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute, Chile, NDN's neighbor across the street. And I have two-part questions. One is pertaining regarding your next-door neighbor and the comments he made regarding President Uribe. I wonder if perhaps you could comment a little bit about that, and especially how this nationalization of Éxito, which is the Franco-Colombian joint venture in Venezuela, and any comments regarding that. And secondly, during your tenure as your country's ambassador here in the United States, you've had the opportunity to travel the country and meet with the emerging Colombian-American community, which is fantastic. And we actually are very much excited about the amazing growth that we're seeing within the Colombian-American community. And I was wondering if you could comment briefly on the challenges and opportunities you see facing the Colombian-American community, and perhaps comment a bit about the prospect of immigration reform during the present year. Thank you.
Very two pertinent questions. With Venezuela, we've been trying, President Uribe, when he came in 2002, tried to work with Venezuela. They're our next-door neighbors. It's like a relationship between brothers, and you have moments when you get along better with your brother and moments when you don't get along so well, but he continues to be your brother. So the same happens with your next-door neighbor. So we will continue to try and work with Venezuela in the most positive way. The kind of verbal attacks that have been taking place lately, we do not feel should be responded to. We do not agree with that. We want to continue working with the Venezuelan people, and President Uribe always says that what we hope is to continue working with the Venezuelan people, and this will be our position. It's very difficult for us when we find that Venezuela seems to be helping, we're having difficulties with our illegal groups and the kind of support that seems to be taking place, etc. So for us, it is an area of concern. It has been an area that we have been discussing very clearly with Venezuela, and we just hope that we'll be able to work in a closer way in fighting drugs and in fighting these kind of problems that are problems for them and are problems for us. With respect to Éxito, the message is very complicated for Venezuela. Yes, it is a Colombian-French company, and the decision to nationalize it, I think, sends, once again, a very negative message from Venezuela to the private sector. I think that, so we will have to see how that plays out. For us, in this latest situation with Venezuela, it's been very complicated because Venezuela has closed down trade to Colombia after the Defense Cooperation Agreement. As part of their response, their negative attitude towards our Defense Cooperation Agreement with the U.S., Venezuela was our second trade partner, and so it has affected us, and we've lost 70% of the trade that we had, which was it was about 7 billion. And so we've now lost 70% of that 7 billion. It was trade that was very particular because it was sort of semi-industrialized products that we're selling Venezuela, which we don't sell in other places. Although today I was talking to the head of our National Industry Association, Andy, and he was telling me that we have been able to recuperate some of this loss in Central America, in Mexico. We are increasing some of our sales to the U.S., to Canada, thank goodness, because we have those preferences that were extended at the end of last year. So this gives us sort of a breathing space as we work towards the free trade agreement, which is what we would like to see in the end, and which I think corresponds to the kind of strong relationship we have. I think the kind of relationship the U.S. and Colombia has merits a free trade agreement, which will give us the stability so that all these areas and this confidence and trust that we've built up through the years, we will be able to see come to fruition in a very healthy economic growth. But as we work towards that, we have the preferences. So for us, the situation with Venezuela has been complicated from the security point of view and from the economic point of view. Migration. This is an issue that when I was foreign minister, when there was the first, I guess it was the McCain-Kennedy proposal, as countries which had immigrants to the U.S., Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and some of the Central American countries, we worked to provide information to your legislators in order for them to have what we hoped would be to have more information about these communities as they were making a decision that only you can make, and we did not want to get involved in your politics, but we did feel that we could give you information which would allow you to look and see at these communities with additional information. So as our Colombian Foreign Ministry asked 4 different institutions at UCLA, Berkeley, at Columbia, at the Florida International University, to do studies on the Colombian communities here in the States. And what it found was that the Colombian communities were playing roles of leadership. For example, in Florida, where many of the second and third generation Cubans are now so integrated that they're not playing a leadership role in Latin American way spaces. Colombians were rising many times to these kind of roles. And in New York and in California, we're finding that they're well-respected, hard workers, etc. And this is, I was studying just the Colombian situation. I think that if you look at migrants in general, these are people who've made a very difficult decision, which is to leave your own country. And if they make this kind of decision, it's because they think there's a lot of potential here, but it also talks about the kind of qualities they have. So this is somebody who's willing to take that difficult step. They're going to this country that has a different language, has a different culture, and yet they're willing to do it. So you're probably getting a very, very good group, which is a very positive group. Yes, there are some bad apples, but those are the minimum. The most of the people that you get here are have initiative, are hard workers, and are very generous. When we look at the data about remittances, I think all of us realize what generosity there is there, because these are people who are living in such a difficult situation here, and yet are sending back such an important percentage of this money that they're making here, not to bring up their child. We all do that for our child. they're bringing up their nieces, their nephews, helping their mother, their sister, their brother. So this is a group that I think has very special qualities. So as you carry out what I think is fundamental, this migration reform, and as you look at the situation in the U.S., what we were trying to do as representatives of some of the people who are now here in your country is to show this other aspect, because unfortunately I think much of this discussion has centered just on the controls, etc. And the U.S. is a country that is so wonderful because it had all these different migration groups. And I think right now, as we look at the migration, it's important to remember your past history and to remember the kind of qualities of the people who have made their way up here to the U.S. because they believe in the American dream. And I think they're people who are participating in a very positive way in continuing to build your American dream.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I'm really enjoying your conversation today. My name is Margaret Pulis. I represent Mexicans and Americans Thinking Together. As a Cuban American who has worked very closely with the Colombian community in Miami, I can attest to the hard work and the professionalism and the leadership that the Colombian community has offered to this great country. We're working very closely on immigration reform, trying to bring, like you said, the stories to the members of Congress, that they know how important it is to have comprehensive immigration reform. At the same time, we do recognize it's important to have economic development in our countries, because many people leave out of financial necessity, not because they want to leave their countries. When you mentioned the education, the courses, updating that for the new industries, I guess, of the future, we developed a program called Quédate en México, that basically it's to incentivize people to come back, to return, and also not to leave. So working very closely with the government and the private sector to develop opportunities, training, and incentivizing, providing them with the funding and the resources that they need in order to stay in Mexico and be able to develop it as a nation. But there are many things that you spoke about that relate, that Colombia has gone through, that Mexico now is going through. Unfortunately, it didn't have that history. So I'm hoping that at some point we're able to work with your embassy and with your representatives, and maybe some of those programs that you've so successfully implemented, we can also learn from that.
Most definitely, and I must say that with President Fox, President Uribe worked very, very closely, but with President Calderon, when he was newly elected, he came over to Colombia and sat down with President Uribe, and we started working on sharing our experience. And we have been sending almost 10,000 different policemen to help and work with your police and look at the different issues also relating to justice and to see how we can work together as we have strengthened our intelligence sharing, which is fundamental, because here what you're finding is new alliances, and it becomes fundamental that we be able to break down these alliances and we know exactly what's going on. We think that Mexico is being very, very courageous. We know how difficult it is. We lived through something like that between 86 and 90 and afterwards. When you decide to face up to these drug traffickers, they fight back with whatever means they can, and in a terrorist way, by killing policemen, by hurting civilians in the kind of terrible way that you're now living. But Colombia still has problems ahead, but definitely we've gotten over that one part, and it just becomes so important that, as Mexico is doing, to continue to send that message. You need to hold strong to send this message and then to be able to move ahead. But the first message to these groups is, you aren't going to beat us, and we have to be strong, and it's hard. It's very, very hard, and we realize it, and we think you're very courageous, but I think that we can attest that you can get over that, but you must continue to be very, very strong in fighting these groups. When I go up to Congress and I hear, but Plan Colombia was only supposed to be for 5 years, and we're now, or 7 years, or we're now into year 10, why have we failed? And I say, we haven't failed, because definitely we've made progress. But what it does show is what a difficult issue this is to fight. And why is it so difficult? Because the kind of monies that are involved are huge. and because the consumption, the demand is still there. It's decreased here in the US to a certain point, but it's gone up to other places. And what we're going to find now, which is very worrisome, I think, for us as part of an international community, is it attacks and it finds its way through the weakest links. And so I think as a region, as a neighborhood, we have to take care of ourselves. So Colombia and Mexico and the US have to work together, but we have to help our neighbors in between, Guatemala, Costa Rica, these smaller countries. We have an incredible responsibility there. We have a responsibility with the Caribbean. But now what's happening is it's going through the weak link through Africa. So we're already finding in Guinea-Bissau and Mali and some of these countries that the drug traffickers are making their way there because this is a weak link into Europe. So this is an issue, and I always say that I wish I were talking about art, Botero, etc., or music, Shakira, and all of them, and not talking about drugs. I feel, and we feel as a country, that we need to talk about this because this is not an issue that has gone away. Maybe we'd like to wish it away, but it's still there, and it's hurting others. So we need to talk about it because we need to keep on working on the demand and the supply side. We need to keep on working on the whole chain, from the production to the sale and the consumption. And there we all have a responsibility. And in fact, those sharp divisions of, at one point, maybe in the year 2000, there was sort of the view that heroin was a problem of Asia and Europe, and cocaine was a problem of the Americas. No longer. We now have all these crosses, so Europe, just as America, has a responsibility with cocaine. But before there was also this idea, there were the producers and the consumers. So you might think that one side was the bad guy and the other was the good guy. No, we're all producers, we're all consumers. Countries like mine, which did not have consumption, now has consumption. Because if you produce drugs, you end up selling drugs because the drug traffickers are always looking for more of a market. So they start from their hometown and make a market as they go through. So they're going to create markets in the countries of transition. So in the Guatemalas and the Honduras or the Barbados or whatever, they're going to try and leave drugs there because they want to create consumption as they make their way up to the larger market in the United States. But the US is not only a consumer, it's a producer. Marijuana, amphetamines, other kinds of drugs are being produced here. So we all have that responsibility, and we need to keep that vision of an integral approach. And that's why, yes, it's a subject that we would like for it to go away, but it's not going to go away if we don't do something about it. And that's why we need to keep on looking at our policies and seeing how we can make a difference and how we can work on the different aspects of the whole chain and especially on the two sides. And so Colombia is working much more now on the demand side also, and we've come up to get help from you. We're trying to treat it also. We're trying to differentiate between the hardcore seller and the person who's just using it for one time, and try and see how we can get medical help to this person and have courts that understand this and deal with it in that way. So we're learning from your experience. But we're also sharing with you ways to fight with the drugs. And so I think what we need to do is continue fighting this. And so I don't think it's that we've been unsuccessful. I just think it's a really difficult issue, and we just have to stay and continue fighting it in an intelligent way, analyzing what we're doing, making adjustments. They're constantly making adjustments. They're finding new ways of selling their drugs. So now they have these semi-submersibles, which are sort of like, they look like submarines, except they're not submarines because they have a chimney so that they get fresh air. They don't have to go underneath. But all you have is this little chimney coming out here, so the radar can't see it. And they become bigger and more sophisticated and more complicated. So they're making all these adaptations. And we, the governments, need to be just as intelligent and try and think ahead and respond in an intelligent way and fight it back. And we're doing it and as I say, in Colombia and in all of these countries, I think we're doing it to save our democracies, because the drugs attempt against our institutions, they corrupt them or they finish them off, because we have to maintain our morals. The drug culture is one of anything goes, it's money that counts, it doesn't matter how you get it, and the important person is the one who has the money. It doesn't matter what kind of ethics, what kind of morals. I think that's one of the concerns we have in Colombia, is how to teach our children about hard work again, about being ethical, etc., and not this whole money, drug culture of the chains, etc., which sounds so beautiful and so enticing, but leaves only pain. And so it's an issue that has to do with health, democracy, ethics, principles. It's a real issue. It's a very important problem that we need to keep on addressing in an intelligent and systematic way.
Yeah. Well, certainly no country has been dealing with it more seriously or sadly for longer than Colombia has. So it's a very, very thoughtful response. You know, let me ask a question, if you all take back the mic metaphorically from the audience for a moment. If you asked American voters today, what's the most important issue on their minds, it would be the economy. And we may see this playing out in the elections, the by-election taking place in Massachusetts today. By the way, Simon, before we leave, I'm going to put you on the spot in front of everybody to talk about what's going to happen there. So the economy is paramount in voters' minds here. Catch us up on what's happening with the economy in Colombia, how you went through the events of the financial crisis over the last year, and how you see the prognosis in the year ahead.
Okay. Colombia had faced, because of the violence associated with drugs in the 90s, this doesn't just happen in a vacuum. What happens when you have violence? Well, you end up without any economic development because there's no confidence and no business wants to come in, and even your own businesses are very worried about the future of your country. So in 1997, we had a recession, which was also affected, and which had been affected before also by another, we had faced a problem of real estate and financial systems that had also bubbled and broken. So we had taken some very strong decisions, and we have a very structured financial institutions and very structured, and we had to address the problems of our mortgages. So that when this recession in the US started last year, we were not affected by that part. But we were affected by the fact that the international economy was affected, and so I think every single country felt the decrease in demand for their products, etc. So Colombia, which after that recession and with the beginning of Plan Colombia and our newfound greater security, had found that its growth rate had been growing substantially from 1.7% in the year 2002 to 7.6% in 2008. We had been growing and growing and growing and growing with foreign direct investment of 10.8 billion in the year 2008. So that foreign direct investment had coming in. So not only had our own economy growing, but we had more foreigners coming in. Last year, it was 0.5. And that is because we were affected by the international situation. We thought that this year we would start again growing at a much lower rate, probably 2 or 3%. But we don't know what the effect of the Venezuela situation is going to be on Colombia. Our unemployment rate, which had been going down, has now been going up again. So we will have to see exactly how much we're able to address by finding new markets, and we'll have to see how affected we are by Venezuela. Definitely, we are an economy that has been handled in a very conservative way, and because of that, we weren't affected so strongly. But I think, like everybody in the world, we were affected. But we're moving ahead, and we're hoping to. Colombia continues, we believe very, very strongly in the free trade agreements, and we continue to work very hard in increasing agreements. At this moment, we're hoping to close one with Canada this year, with the European Union this year. We're starting negotiations with Panama, with Korea. We've just strengthened our relationship with the Central American countries, with Mexico And so what we will continue to work in trying to open new markets for Colombian products. And as I said in my conversation this morning with the head of the National Industrial Association, he finds that we are finding new products, and our private sector is having to be very proactive and having to go out and find new markets. And so we'll have to see how the year turns out to be. But Ecuador, which is where we had been having problems, has been improving. Our sales there our exchange has also been improving. So, and there are new areas, Chile, Peru, apparently we're selling more. So we'll have to see how it goes. But we're an economy that has been sort of a very conservative economy. And what we're trying to do is get our private sector to move a bit more. But to open markets is not easy.
Yes, over here.
Kelly McBride from the Carter Center. I'd like to ask you about the democratic security policy and the consolidation plan. There's a lot of talk in Washington and also in Colombia that the policy's kind of gone as far as it can go and it's run aground, and there aren't the public policies and the defense strategy and doctrine to back it up. So I'm curious about the future of that, regardless of who wins the elections in May. Thank you.
Right. I think that the democratic, the principles or the idea between our democratic security was that it would be strengthening security, rule of law in the country while respecting human rights and our institutions. And I think if we look at all of our different statistics, homicides, kidnappings, massacres, etc., the situation in the country has improved just dramatically. The decrease in all of these kind of situations has gone, I mean, we've decreased the homicides by 70%, massacres by 80%, kidnappings, fortunately, almost by 87%, etc. So the country is definitely in a better situation. And I think it has been done with great interest in improving our human rights. This doesn't mean that we haven't had difficulties, and as we've had to face them, I think the government has taken very strong measures to address them. However, and I think one of the important things also has been that as we were fighting the drugs and fighting the illegal groups, we also offered the option of trying to make peace with those groups, the illegal groups that were willing to sit down to make peace. So as a result, we came up with a new law, Peace and Justice Law, which was for all groups, for the FARC, for the ELN, for the self-defense groups, any group that was willing to sit down. The FARC and the ELN did not accept to sit down. The paramilitary groups who had made rapprochements to the government before UDI arrived through the church, sat down, and we were able to demobilize about 35,000 of their men. And with this stronger push against the illegal groups, 11,000 individual demobilizations, that's 11,000 people have deserted from the FARC and the ELN. So we now have a group of 55,000 people who have demobilized. This placed a huge, it has meant that we have a huge challenge. And any of you who have studied the situation in Central America, as I know that your center has, know that when you bring people in, people who have been carrying arms, if you're not able to bring them in and offer them sustenance, and at the same time economic sustenance, and at the same time be able to reintegrate them into your society, there is recidivism. And for some of them, what becomes easiest is to go back to carrying arms. So when we assumed this, we knew that we had to carry out a very strong program to make sure that these young men and women, most of them are young, some of them were in their 30s, still young, it's all relative, isn't it, in life, needed to make sure that they got the education, the psychological help so that they could be reintegrated. But we have to remember that we have a country that still has drugs, which are looking for people who have the kind of qualifications that these people have. So for us, it has been even more difficult to get them to reintegrate. So what we have found now is that there are some criminal bands that have been created, which are drug traffickers, but who have been seeking out some of these men and women to come and be part of the criminal bands, to be part of this drug trafficking because of the kind of qualities that they have. The view that some have is that as a result, many of these paramilitary groups that came into our society have fallen back to violence. The analysis that the OAS has made, the analysis that our police have made, show that the majority, probably 85%, we think we have a recidivism probably only of 15% or 10%. Most of them have been able to reintegrate and start their life again. Only 10 or 15% of them have fallen into these criminal bands that are involved in drug trafficking. And this drug trafficking then has led to violence in certain areas of the country, one of which is the Pacific, because a lot of the drugs, as we have been successful in fighting tracing the way that the planes were leaving Colombia, meant that now the planes are leaving right from our border, heading towards Venezuela or heading towards Brazil and down, or going to the Pacific, means that our Pacific coast has become the object of a lot of the drug kind of gang warfares that you have. So the Tumaco, Buenaventura, and all those areas have great difficulties. Medellin, which had a group of 3,000 people who reintegrated, and now there's been an increase in some violence in Medellin, has led people to say that we haven't been successful. I would hold a contrary position in that I think we need to see where we came from and where we're going. So we came from reintegrating 55,000 men and women, and we came from having a huge drug trafficking problem. We are now down probably to half the area and half, a drug trafficking problem which is much smaller. We have some recidivism, but it's small. But that combination continues to be worrisome. And it continues to lead to a level of violence that we would like to see decrease even more. So I don't think that the democratic security policy has not been successful. I think that it is a democratic security policy that needs to look at the different stages where we're in. We are concerned at this moment with some of the violence that's taking place in some of the cities, and people are talking about looking at that in greater length. I think that it's not that the policy per se is wrong, but I do think that we need to continue to make adjustments, and we need to look and see what is happening. So that I would say that the proposals being made by the candidates, different candidates who would like to stress more the urban violence and address that more, etc. All these are new ways about thinking about which I think are important, but I think that the democratic security policy has been successful up to now. It needs adjustments. I think the kind of debates that are taking place and that should take place around an election are healthy, and we should see what we can learn from there and what adjustments need to be made. It's not perfect, most definitely not, and so I think that what's important is if we can keep a healthy view and a healthy discussion going on.
We have just about run out of time, but before I thank you,